Thanks a lot for the invitation, Thomas and Vinny. It's really nice to be invited. And thanks for organizing this kind of seminar, which I think is really, really important. I think it contributes to a growing community of performers who don't feel quite at home within the kind of traditional confines of, I don't know, conservatory approved instrumental categories, and who are willing to experiment with their role as musicians, as performers, and whatever they want to call it. This is the first time I do this kind of thing over Zoom, but normally it would be nice to just meet all of you in person. I've seen some new friends and some old friends, but I look forward to having a conversation about these topics with you all after this talk, which I have planned will be about 30 to 40 minutes. I think our slot today is about 60 minutes, so I think we are flexible with regards to time. Also, maybe Thomas, you can just stop me if it's getting too long here. I'd like to start by presenting some of my own views on the topic of new practices, shall we say, in quotation marks, in and around instrumental music performance, because many of these practices do not always relate only to music as much as they do to performance art, experimental theater, or conceptual art, and so on. My focus areas today will be experimental or extended practices, sometimes called post-instrumental, or I named mine post-percussive back in the day. Maybe post-instrumental is more interesting because it covers a broader field. I also think the term work-specific performance practice is interesting because it says something about how these works really build something from scratch each time, and they build something from nothing. Without including an instrument's playing performance tradition, for instance. My focus has been on instrumental choreography and the kind of extended performance techniques on instruments or new instruments, less so on kind of pure choreography as in the conducting piece by Sten Andersen. That's kind of one side of it. We'll look at some of those pieces for sure. So Sten Andersen's black box music will be presented, some works by Leffler, another Danish composer who works in this field, and a bunch of other things that we'll come to in a minute. And hopefully at the end we can have an open conversation about some of the more overarching things, whether you're a percussionist or not, like what effects do these practices have on us as performers, whether musicians or other practices. I'm thinking about the elements of non-specialization, of amateurism, and the sort of precarity that often arises when we leave the safe space of our basic craft. I will start by doing a quick run through of the historical developments within my field, that of percussion, and try to trace some steps to where a huge part of this practice is situated today, namely in a sort of periphery. There is no center, there is only periphery. Of course, large part of this percussion practice has always remained truthful to its historical origins, that especially within the classical and romantic orchestra tradition and inside the academies. So there's this kind of classic delay inside the academies towards what's going on in the scene, in the field, in the professional field. But an equally large part of the practice has developed into something which I believe is quite unparalleled in Western art music. And I will come back to this point later. Following the brief history lecture, we'll take a look at some of the ideas based on my own artistic research project, which started about 10, 11 years ago. There was one called This Is Not a Drum, which, oops, I'm not able to slide here. Okay, give me a second. Here. This is not a drum, towards a post-percussive practice, which Thomas mentioned. And then after that, we did one called Music with a Reel, which was more about including outer musical materials into a context of instrumental music, using samples and visual material and so on. By the way, since we're in Belgium, the title of this one, "This Is Not a Drum," is an obvious hats off to the famous painting "This Is Not a Pipe" by Magritte. But I guess you got that already. Okay. In my own research, I did not focus exclusively on movement, like I mentioned, which I believe is the kind of core focus of this seminar lecture series. But I focused rather on all sorts of extended practices departing from experimental percussion. And for this reason, my examples will also not exclusively be about movement work as such. I will show quite a few examples, musical examples, and after this we can open up the conversation to topics that might interest you in a more general sense. But like I said, all of mine will be taken from my own kind of repertoire list, more or less. And I think, like Thomas said, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand, but he already explained that. Okay, so when I started my research, I didn't go into it thinking like, oh, I'll just I'm going to find out what post-instrumental practices are. I didn't even think about that term. I started out thinking I'm a multi-percussionist, and I come from a very complex practice, which involves a lot of instruments. I did not think of myself as something else than a percussionist, maybe sometimes a theatrical performer, but always within the realms of kind of amateurism. But then I started to take a look at the history of percussion and percussion practices throughout history, which really begun in the West with these kinds of things, which pretty much includes everything you'll hear in orchestra music up until Mahler. You know, it's some sort of timpani, early timpani models. There's a bass drum, the davul, Turkish bass drum. There are the cymbals and the jingles and the triangles. So if you think about symphonic music from Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, all the alla turca, all the Turkish influences which happened in the kind of post-colonial area, in the colonial area, sorry. This is where it came from, the banda turca, the Turkish instruments, which were, you know, noise makers and signaling instruments from the military tradition that were being imported into European music. And so the instruments went from a kind of military thing into a folkloric thing, into a concert hall thing. At first timpani and then single instruments, like I said, the cymbals, played one musician per instrument. And then during the 1920s, 30s, typically in works by Varese or Stravinsky, you would see percussionists having to play on more instruments. So we have already this kind of idea of multitasking and multi-percussion, which is a central term here. And then we have the only percussion music of the mid-20th century, following art movements like Dadaism and Futurism, where noise became a central and integral element of Western music for the first time in its history. This would typically be works by Lou Harrison, John Cage, composers who also, inspired by Dada and Duchamp, maybe first of all, included everyday objects like household implements into their works. To the first solo pieces, which were made in the late 50s, the early 60s. This one here, I think, is Morton Feldman work from 1963. This is, by the way, one of the most renowned advocates of solo percussion music, Stephen Schick. This is the piece by Helmut Lachemann from 1966. We can see there is a kind of systematic range of metals, skins, and mallet instruments and wooden instruments, creating a kind of an anterior sort of an environment for movement, where the percussionist has a kind of very choreographed goes through kind of a choreograph mapping, which is at this stage notated in descriptive notation. And to these kinds of things, which are the more recent phenomena, really a percussion concerto played on a desktop cello and electric guitars for desktop cello and ensemble, or a black box, as we're going to come back to in a second, or the body only. This is a work called Corporel by Vinko Globokar, written in the 1980s. Or this classic by one of the pioneers of electronic music, Alvin Lucier. Piece is called Music for Solo Performer. It's not about percussion per se, but it's about percussion instruments being excited in unconventional ways, in this case by way of brain waves. To this kind of thing, this is a more recent IRCAM production, which has a lot of fancy electronics in it. This is Philipp Spieser, who is wearing sensory gloves, which he has to place on certain spaces in the room, and then that will trigger certain video, light, and sound patches. But he's still a percussionist, so this is a sort of mix of dance and percussion performance. And so again, back to my argument, I think if we compare to historical cello playing or historical keyboard playing to contemporary cello playing or contemporary keyboard playing, those instruments still have a lot of the same technology connected to them. It's still about using the bow, using the keys or the hammers. Maybe one thing that changes, of course, when music got atonal and everything like that, the fingers and hands had to kind of recalibrate their movements across the fingerboards and across the keys when they moved away from tonal structures. But still, the kind of technology remained connected to pressing strings and hitting or pressing keys, which is fundamentally different from percussion. And one more thought here, with the percussion sections of the orchestras, composers could assign auxiliary tasks, adding all kinds of noises and colors to otherwise fixed lineups. Like the string section remains the string section, the wind section remains the wind section, and so on. And this is not the case with the percussion section because they have to play all sort of auxiliary tasks. And this is still the case in orchestras today. You could never assign like the first violinist to play musical saw. This will have to be played by the percussionist because the string player has one instrument to relate to. And this might be due to the sort of low status these simple noisemakers have in the traditional hierarchy of musical arts, due to their primitive nature and the kind of low degree of technical competence needed to play them. And as a result, the practitioners of the percussion section have become the sort of polyglots, the potato, if you like. I'm not sure if there's a connection between polyglot and potato, but anyways, they use their hybrid skills. They have, through these hybrid skills, they have developed a new technical musical grammar, which has kind of been motivated by the number of sounds and instruments they have to relate to. And this has kind of fostered a new breed of performers, and at least this is my argument, and I'm happy to discuss this later. So this way, percussion has become a sort of all-inclusive practice rather than an exclusive practice. And by that, I mean, there's probably no modern percussionist that will say that I don't play this thing if a piece requires it. But I think if you ask any string quartet in the world, and the percussionist and the composer would like to have a section with only cello and 3 violas, I'm pretty sure the 2 violinists will not be happy to play the viola. So yeah. I try to locate then a sort of second history of percussion after the kind of birth of percussion music only, which happened from the 1930s onwards, and solo music, especially from the 1950s. I tried to find the different trajectories or the different categories of the canon. So there was a lot of works exploring timbre and resonance, which of course belong to more sort of general aesthetic thinking than to percussion as such. So typically John Cage, Stockhausen, Feldman, Lachemann, all the kind of major modernist names would write pieces in this vein. There was some really significant pulse-based work written in the 60s and the 70s. For instance, by Steve Reich, drumming is a total classic. And more or less all works by Xenakis, Pierre Nergol, Alvarez, Kevin Volans, and so on. And then there's a line of music theater or performance pieces, and central names here are Mauricio Kagel, Georges Apagis, Vinko Globokar, Frederic Rzewski, François Saran, and Jessie Marino, of course, would belong in this category, I feel. The question mark behind the 2015, I think about her piece called Piece for the Middle Seat of an Airplane, and I couldn't really find the year. If she's here, maybe she can inform us. And then I kind of, so the goal was to kind of establish a way of thinking about all these other pieces that didn't really belong anywhere. And that's where I came up with the idea of this post-instrumental or the post-percussive canon, which is really a term borrowed from, I mean, postmodernist, and I thought of it as like a popular music term, post-rock, which is described as rock instruments used for non-rock purposes, where it's kind of, you have the medium of instrumental music, or in this case rock, and you use it for something else. So it really describes a situation where the instrument doesn't matter anymore, or you try to build a universe from whatever object you have at hand, which is not a traditional instrument. Or if it is a traditional instrument, it certainly implies a very unconventional use of that traditional instrument. So for instance, something that can be played on a cello by a percussionist or a post-instrumental practitioner really implies he or she cannot play a sort of Dvorak type sound on the cello, which requires many years of training. And in my thinking, one of these early post-instrumental pieces were Helmut Lachamann's Pression from 1969, where he really develops a sort of instrumental choreography. As you can see, it's a kind of descriptive notation. The key is really the fingerboard and the Steg, I'm not sure, the bridge maybe in English. So really, if you hold the cello in your hands, and you can kind of locate all these things on the surface of the instrument. First string, slide down to the next, slide back up, slide down, employ second string, and then third string. It's really something that I could figure out being a percussionist, and there's very little kind of cellistic training needed to play this piece. It was really through these pieces that I, and also the Salute for Caudrell one, which we can see in a second, that I discovered that this is a kind of work-specific and instrument-specific material that is based in extended techniques developed by the composer, and it only really requires the instruments to be played in a traditional manner. And this experience kind of led me into thinking that there is really a genre in its own, that is these pieces are available, in my opinion, to anyone who takes the time to learn them, and who's you can be a kind of a musician from any genre if you like, and you have to have knowledge of notation and how to decode this kind of notation, and then you would be able to learn it. Maybe let's take a look at Salute for Caldwell here in a very cool interpretation done by Xavier Leroy. Let's see here. We have a faint point. I think it's around here. So the guitarists are actually sitting behind the screen, and the dancers are kind of just imitating that. And I guess it was Lachamann's kind of instrumental choreography that inspired Leroy's wish to make a whole performance based on instrumental choreography. So let's take a look at some of the other examples. I'm going to now talk briefly about the black box music concerto, if you like, for black box and ensemble. The piece is in a way a miniaturized theatrical stage. It's just a black box compressed. It has microphones in each corner, in the floors and on the ceiling. I have two hands inside the box to play around with hand cymbals, which all have a corresponding sound. The piece plays with a specialization between the box and the hall. So if I make a sound in the right upper corner, there will be a sound from a loudspeaker in the right upper corner in the hall. And it's about the magnification of microscopic gestural and sonic events. So we can see a little excerpt here. Let's see. Yeah, the piece goes on for about half an hour, but I can maybe play the end, a little bit from the end, which is a sort of installation where I build an instrument of with four rubber bands, and there's a fan which has a string connected to it, which excite these rubber bands. So it becomes a sort of cacophony of low bass sounds, and the ensemble imitates everything that's happening inside the box. Okay, you get the point. Here's how one page of the score. The solo part looks like. Really, each note has a movement. So if you look at bar, this, can you see this arrow here, Thomas? Do you see this? Yeah. So
yes,
this,
we can see it.
Yeah, this means hit the floor. This means point to the right. This means like hitting with your fist towards the camera, point to the right, conducting movement to the right, point finger, and so on. So it's pretty much just a mapped out choreography using 8 notes. So it's not that scary actually. What is tricky with this thing is that there's a lot of things that you can't really see because you only have a little 8-inch monitor to relate to, and it's mirrored, and there's really no 3 dimensions. So this piece, and it's really built with very cheap materials. Like this fan is something from Conrad for $5.99, and it tends to break down very often. And it's really kind of precarious in the sense that these things can just stop working in the middle of performance sometimes. So that's also something to bring into the discussion, is kind of the fragility of some of these things. Okay, I see that time is running. I would love to have showed you more things from there, but we can just maybe skip a few things so we have some time for discussion. I'll just talk about this really briefly. This is another Sten Andersen piece written for 2 female vocalists in 2007, where he kind of created like a scale of noises from the lungs into the throat and the palate and the teeth and the lips and then nails and fingers. It's really about some sort of muscular choreography of the throat. And I also blow on a piece of paper. Yeah. I think I have to skip the presentation here. It's something called an Airguiro. So it's really a choreography back and forth on this piece of paper, as well as using the throat. So this is some kind of, I don't know, inside the body piece, if that makes sense. I'd like to show a few other things by colleagues in the field. I'd like to show you a piece by Simon Leffler, the Danish composer, called E for Lights and Triangles, played by Reconvert. It's a young trio from Basel in Switzerland. So again, a piece commissioned by a percussion ensemble in Melbourne called Speak Percussion, and they get a piece which is very pianistic in a way. They play on keyboards and has a lot of electronics in it. So again, a piece that can be played by anyone who cares to learn those movements. This is a choreography piece written for a percussion quartet in Bern. The piece is called Walk. I'll show you a short excerpt.
Test 1 2 1 2.
Okay. This is a piece by Speak Percussion again, Robin Fox and Eugene Ugeti, which develops the idea of pendulum music from Steve Reich. Really one of the most creative groups in this genre today. Speak Percussion from Melbourne. Hold on, where's my... Okay, I see that time is running a bit. Thomas, how much longer can I go on with examples and stuff? What do you think? I mean...
Oh, I think if 5, 6, 10 minutes, keep going. They're all really interesting.
Right. And then, okay, so I have to skip a few things, and which is okay. Maybe let's just listen to a final example written by Carola Bauchold for Louisa Markson, a percussionist based in Switzerland. A little short example. Okay.
Qu'est-ce que votre chauffeur? Belama, Massimo Chou. Tu as voulu ce tachalo. Qu'est-ce que votre chauffeur?
Right. So Louisa is also a percussionist who commissioned the work for percussion, and she got this. Okay, so I think we stop with examples now. I mean, this list could go on forever. Sorry.
Yeah, so you've still got more time if you want to show a couple more. We've still got time. Go ahead.
Okay, but I think I also have some more things to say, and maybe we can just add this list to the documentation maybe, and people can do a bit of self-study. I don't know.
Sure, we can do that too.
Yeah. So I mean, these are just a few of the names we could mention here, and works we could display. But I mean, other really interesting names such as Jennifer Walsh, Gigi Moreno, Robin Hoffman, Francois Saran, Alexander Schubert, and this is Black, Yiran Zhao, and many others have in the past 10-15 years immensely to these kinds of works. I think Jessu is giving a talk tomorrow, so you can get her point of view on, I mean, directly from the source, on her take on her work. I'd just like to conclude with some final remarks that I made when finishing my project. I think the bigger question from these that arises from these pieces is how we relate to and think about and talk about certain types of musicianship that have emerged in the late 20th and the early 21st century, especially following aesthetic developments in the field of new and experimental music, and how our guild of instrumental performers respond to these aesthetic turns. It has become possible to be a percussionist performer today without hitting or striking anything. And that this says something about how this practice, at least within Western art music, has become a sort of periphery with no center. It's exclusively built on kind of fringe events, as it were, fringe activities. The technical skills required for compositions such as these we have now seen cannot be reduced to any common or general exercises that can be put separately in order to support one's fundamental ability to perform them. Their diversity and contextual specificity elude a reliable overall definition and application. Hence, we arrive at the concept of the work-specific technical practice that I propose as one of the key concepts in defining post-instrumental practices, including post-percussion, as opposed to a general instrumental practice. The consequence for performers of such works is that in principle there is no unifying technical legacy towards which they gravitate. Unlike classical music's technical method books and etudes, whose purpose is to provide general practice material for particular technical skills applicable to multiple situations, these works may unfold themselves across or in between conventional instrumental practices, extended techniques, performance art, theater, installation, or video art, etc. So rather than being homogeneous, they are fragmented and multi-directional, and thus constitute the need for a continuous reorientation on the part of the performer. However, and this perhaps makes them distinctly different from Fluxus, Dada, and more loosely notated performance practices. They are very fixed, strict, or more or less complex rhythmical notation in a kind of score setting, a feature which requires an expert musician, if not necessarily a percussionist. We cannot point to a set of coherent skills suggested by this post-instrumental repertoire itself, perhaps with the exception of one skill, and that is that of adaptability. Coherent technique is systematic, organized, and consistent, post-instrumental, liberated from traditional pitch structures, harmonies, etc., also often employing outer musical materials, are unsystematic, disorganized, and fragmented. They are alloys of bits and pieces from diverse practices gathered according to one's own desires and their requirements posed by individual works. Thus, I claim that one can define one's own set of skills inside this practice and shape it according to what is asked by the music one wishes to play. Furthermore, that the adaptability itself represents another form of virtuosity. And this non-hierarchical, personalized, anarchaic, in quotation marks, approach might be a good subject for discussion later, especially with regards to how this practice is handled by the educational institutions. In avant-garde music traditions, composers and performers have deliberately challenged idiomatic ideals in search of new expressive means by transgressing technical conventions. This applies to all instruments of the orchestra. Nonetheless, percussionists in particular are exposed to this constantly since they relate to so many different objects. Percussion today is so chaotic that to provide a detailed account of its numerous specific manifestations would be an impossible task. The skill of recalibrating one's technique and movement to work-specific needs thus become one of our craft's most valuable and necessary abilities. In this way, it is possible to argue that the overarching concept of adaptability in itself represents a meta-instrument which the practitioner has to learn and adapt to. I'll just draw a short concluding remark and then we can go to questions. In the 1980s, Morton Feldman said in an interview with percussionist John Williams, he spoke about the one-of-a-kind pieces of the percussion repertoire, how so many pieces were unique in their own design and it didn't make sense to kind of keep writing pieces on those same models. Because some of the masterpieces kind of began and closed off a genre in one go. Pieces like Sapfa by Yannick Xenakis and Rebond are good examples of this. How much further can one go in terms of technical difficulty, number of instruments, this kind of Olympian virtuosity thing. Personally, I also believe that new and interesting material today is no longer found in acoustic sound research on standardized sources and traditional virtuosity, but rather in the hybrids of theatrical, performative, audiovisual, yet formally coherent or stringent work, which I believe is the strength of carefully planned compositional techniques, and also work that is bold and daring, which illuminates the paradoxical situation that the lack of specialization and expertise is a significant form of specialization and a very unique potential for creativity. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Håkon. That was really, really, really interesting. Can we open the floor now for any questions? Sorry, the person next to me is making a little bit of noise. Does anybody have any questions for Håkon at this moment? Yes, there's one in the chat from Neil Luck. I'll read it out loud. I was wondering whether Håkon might say anything about rehearsing/realizing this work, whether the rehearsal process, the relationship between composer and performer, takes on a different dynamic for him or demands different kinds of interactions in this repertoire, or not. That's a good question.
I was wondering whether Håkon might say anything about rehearsing. Which work do you mean, Neil?
This broader sort of field of repertoire, I suppose. This kind of, yeah, that seems to be demanding different skills from you, I suppose.
Yeah, right. So what I realized kind of midway or towards the end of my project, when I was just doing these new works, was that my basic skill kind of got I lost them a little bit because I got so busy building new instruments and just using a whole different vocabulary. So it was very confusing, I have to say. And one of my reactions to this was like making a record with music in C major for guitars, and I made a very traditional record because I just needed to feel like I'm a musician still and I can play C major on the guitar. But that was my thing. But really it becomes, I think very often it's not easy to foresee the amount of practical challenge that takes a lot more time than just learning the music, which you would, if you just sat down with the score on your piano or guitar or marimba or whatever, you kind of start day one to learn the music. Whereas in the piece by Simon Leffler or the Black Box music by Simon Sten Andersen, it was really first constructing the whole thing, and then even at the day of the premiere, just having to sew new curtains or just ridiculous things that had no connection to the actual music. And after I think 40 or 50 concert performances, which means probably 150 rehearsal days, a couple of months ago, I had to throw the whole instrument because it was just worn down. And I'm now renting one from my colleague Roberto Magueda, because I think there are 3 or 4 other percussionists who have built black boxes. So I mean, there's a sort of it isn't the Steinway grand piano, which was developed over centuries with kind of a lot of experience from very gifted craftsmen and women. This is just like stuff screwed together with gaffer tape and glue, and so it's really what's the point here? It's really it feels very and it's adolescence yet still the whole quality thing connected to the actual what is the instrument, and you just spend a lot of time on practical things and this adaptability thing. So I guess to sum up, it takes a lot more energy on outer musical things. Does it make sense, Neil?
That's brilliant, thank you. Yeah.
So Peter Matthijssen has a question or remark in regard to pression. And go ahead, Peter.
Håkon, you bloody bastards.
Hi there.
What were you saying about pression?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I know you play that
I was just wondering. No, I was just wondering your remark because I think maybe you got a little bit too fast. Because I think it's a lot more than about just translating the score and then learning it. I think it's also about even finding a good instrument to perform it on.
Yeah.
Because you often have this discussion with cellists where they say like, hey, if I played like a piece of Lachemann, I just take my second cello and, but you will realize from the moment you start playing this piece, you realize, if you play it on a very good, maybe 18th century cello, you will see that, wow,
yes,
it's actually really composed for a very good instrument.
Yeah.
And I also think really a lot of the movements are really related to, of course, not the sound world of the classical cello, but about really, even about, it's about hugging the cello, but just in another way.
Totally. I didn't mean to disregard the Lachamann's connection to the concert music hall history, and I agree totally with you. It's not like he's not connected to the lo-fi aesthetics at all. I also play like Salute for Caldwell, and you really need a top concert instrument, otherwise it just sounds crap. And when I bought a China cello for like 300 US for this desktop piece, which was really about hitting and striking the cello. But for the Pression, I borrowed Tanya Orling's cello, and that was a world of difference, of course. And I'm not saying that I will play the piece as good as a cellist, because it's really I'm a dabbler, total dabbler with cello. But it was kind of possible. There's one place I think where you play a long sustained note like in a traditional way on a D flat or something. Is that right?
Yeah, maybe we can do a challenge, Håkon.
No.
You're up to it,
No, but I think this is really interesting though, because I remember my percussion teacher saying this when I did one of my presentations many years ago, that there's something to the way a percussionist plays a woodblock. You would think anyone can just do this boop on the woodblock, but there's something if you have like 10 years of training. And if you have 3 weeks of training, you do it with a different grace. So I totally, when I say I played Pression, it's really within the sort of total amateurism, paradigm. It's not for Deutsche Grammophon. It's, yeah. What is that? Okay.
Hey, hello, can everybody please turn off their microphones except for Håkon, or if you're asking a question?
Thank you, Håkon.
Thanks.
Thanks, Peter.
I see Heitze also has a question. Can you see that in the chat?
What would you say is the creative role the performer has in those examples, such as B-Box, where you both have to build an instrument? Yeah, that's a super interesting, the kind of nature of the collaboration, I guess is the question. In terms of Black Box, we did all the modeling of the box together, and I mean, we just workshopped for days and days about what was possible to do, and and then Simon kind of went home to his desktop and composed with these findings, right? So since we didn't have a grammar for the piece, he had to develop the grammar from scratch, basically. And all these hand gesture things for him, that's his inventions. That's totally his material. The stuff in the third movement, which is more about like rubber bands and fans moving around and all this kind of more sound-related stuff, we found together in workshops. But then he developed a form, of course. So the piece is pretty much, I mean, it's his composition. There are other pieces that I've been part of that are more like, I would say 50-50 or some kind of ratio along that scale of co-creative performer meets composer. But anyways, this is I think the competence the instrumentalist brings to the table in a collaborative process is really, really valuable in terms of this kind of non-instrumental or beyond standard instrumental concepts, because it's really about getting the hands dirty together and finding out things. It's really, I think I know very few examples where the performer isn't inside this process. Like there's not like you get a piece ready to go in the mail, as you can if you write a piece for vibraphone or piano. So everyone's working really hands-on. Okay, does it make sense? Tony?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, it answered my question. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, we have one. I learned. Yeah. Does this learning curve go faster with each? Yes, it does. It does. Like, this probably, I'm not scientific about this at all. It's just a feeling that if you ever learn, you know, the stuff, you become good at the stuff you do a lot. So if you're good at adaptability, this becomes second nature. You can do these things more easy than if so kind of first time off. Yes, absolutely. You also become more critical, maybe, because you've seen more things. So yes. Any objections though? I liked how does this apply to, I spoke really highly of the percussionist role today, that as if there's some kind of special breed. Any protests to this though? I mean, there's so many other people. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I protest.
I'd love to hear some protests. Yes.
But I think Tony had a question that I protest.
Yes, do it.
Please go ahead, Tony.
Hi, Håkon. Thanks for the talk. Question about sound quality. So traditional training comes with many bad and tired things, but one comes with it, an incredible sensitivity to shaping the sound. How do you substitute that when playing on the new or newer than new things?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you substitute it. You kind of take your sensibility for sound and apply it to whatever object or whatever situation you're producing sound, or you know, in. But I agree with you. I have a strong sensibility to sound because I'm a percussionist, because we are, you know, the kinds of people who look for the green mallet because it gives a different sound than the red mallet, which is the right one in any given context. Or we use this mixing bowl and not this mixing bowl because it has a better overtone or whatever. But I mean, if I'm doing something with movement, I'm probably on the same level as my grandmother, you know, like I'm not a trained dancer. Or I took some basic training in with Schauspieler, what's that? An actor for voice training and things like that. But I've never taken a singing lesson. I took some voice training. Oops, something happened. So I think on sound, I'm an expert. On movement, on dance for sure. On singing, I would be a total amateur. But this amateurism is so integrated into the percussion repertoire, because, you know, for about 70 years now, we've been between this fine line of professionalism and amateurism, if you're an experimental musician, that is.
Yeah, just a very brief follow-up. What you just mentioned with the woodblock, that the professional percussionist plays that one woodblock hit differently. When you play together with a harp player who plays for 35 years, and you produce an impulse on a never heard object, you will relate, or you will want to relate with the same quality of music making to that player, with or without naivety or the childish approach.
Was that a question? Yeah.
What did that?
Yeah, I think the whole, I don't have a really super strong answer to that. I think the whole idea of quality is being questioned by this practice, and I'm not even sure if it's supposed to be sounding like long play. You know what I mean? It isn't about that kind of quality concept, which is defined by the classical canon and by this kind of turbo high octane Formula One virtuosity of the classical music, which is I mean, if we can, I'm happy to discuss the kind of politics of that, and but I don't think the composers and performers in this genre are looking for this kind of shiny virtuosity and this kind of quality. I'm pretty sure that's being not neglected, but negated, and people are looking for different qualities. So, I mean, and this is a very interesting topic. I mean, how did this whole kind of Superman, Superwoman virtuosity arise? And I think I once heard a lecture with Ian Pace, the pianist, and he referred to the Cold War and how the East and the West kind of competed in having the most virtuosic musicians, because that would be the mark of a great culture. And so I don't think we're on that train at all. You know, it's not about that.
Thank you. I'm very glad to hear that. So I enjoy very much the discussion. What constitutes quality?
Yeah, it's a hard one. Yeah. Anyone like to pick up on that? What constitutes quality within the paradigm of education, for instance? That's a hard one. Thomas, you want to point at someone here?
Maybe we can point it towards the concert as a means to check out perhaps a type of quality.
That's a very good segue, Winnie. Bravo. No, that's thank you very much, Håkon. This has been really interesting, and I think it is time indeed to move on to the concert. So we can perhaps after the concert, when everybody has had something to drink, we can talk about quality and really get into it. So thank you, Håkon. It was really very interesting, and I hope you'll stick around for the concert. And